Everyone saw Peter Spencer as a self-made titan, and his overweight, soft-spoken wife, Beatrice, as the punchline to his success story. When he handed her divorce papers to run off with his beautiful marketing director, he thought he was cutting dead weight. He didn't know he was evicting himself. The grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel in Chicago was awash in the warm glow of crystal chandeliers and the intoxicating hum of new money. Peter Spencer, CEO of Spencer Logistics, held court near the ice sculpture, a glass of Macallan 18 in his hand. At 42, Peter was the picture of a modern corporate conqueror, sharp-jawed, impeccably groomed, and poured into a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. He was a man who believed his own press releases, a man who thought the world bent to his will simply because he willed it so. Across the room, sitting alone at table 4, far enough from the cameras, but close enough to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage, was his wife, Beatrice. Beatrice was not the kind of woman CEO magazines featured on their society pages. She was heavily overweight, a fact that Peter brought up with thinly veiled cruelty during every argument they ever had. While the other executives' wives were razor-thin former models draped in sheer silk, Beatrice wore a conservative, custom-made navy gown that prioritized comfort and coverage over high fashion. She had a kind, round face, intelligent dark eyes, and a quiet demeanor that most people mistook for timidity. To the Chicago elite, Beatrice was an anomaly. The running joke at the country club was that she must have blackmail material on Peter. Because why else would a man worth $400 million stay married to a woman who looked like her? Peter shared this sentiment. He had married Beatrice 12 years ago, long before the yachts and the private jets. Back then, he was a struggling entrepreneur, working out of a damp, converted garage in Evanston, practically drowning in debt. Beatrice had been a quiet, steady presence. But as Peter's company exploded into a national logistics empire, his ego swelled. He began to view his wife not as a partner, but as an embarrassing albatross. She didn't fit the aesthetic of his new, ultra-luxurious life. From her seat, Beatrice watched her husband. She saw the way he leaned in just a little too close to his newly appointed director of public relations, Chloe DuPont. Chloe was 26, stunningly beautiful, with a figure built for Instagram and an ambition sharp enough to cut glass. Beatrice watched Peter place a familiar hand on the small of Chloe's back. She saw the way Chloe threw her head back in laughter, touching Peter's bicep. Beatrice didn't cry. She didn't storm over and cause a scene. Instead, she took a slow sip of her sparkling water, her expression unreadable. "Is the seat taken, Mrs. Spencer?" Beatrice looked up to see David Ross, Peter's chief financial officer. David was one of the few people in Peter's orbit who treated Beatrice with genuine respect. "It's all yours, David." Beatrice smiled softly. David sat heavily, loosening his bow tie. "Peter's in his element tonight. The new automated warehouses in Detroit are projecting a 20% increase in Q3 margins. He's practically glowing." "He always did love an audience," Beatrice replied, her voice smooth and devoid of bitterness. "And how are the financials holding up on the back end, David? Has the board approved the new debt restructuring?" David blinked, mildly surprised. Peter always told everyone that his wife couldn't balance a checkbook, let alone understand corporate finance. "Actually, yes. We're pushing it through next week. The primary stakeholder, Aegis Horizon Trust, gave the green light yesterday." "Aegis Horizon?" Beatrice murmured, swirling the ice in her glass. "They've been very supportive of Peter." "Supportive is an understatement," David laughed. "Whoever runs Aegis is the only reason Spencer Logistics exists. They swooped in 10 years ago when we were facing bankruptcy and bought up 60% of the equity. They're a ghost, though. completely silent partners. Peter hates that he doesn't own a controlling interest, but he loves the blank checks. Beatrice offered a polite, close-lipped smile, her eyes drifting back to her husband, who was now whispering something in Chloe's ear. "Well, I suppose we all have our silent partners, David." Later that night, the limousine ride back to their sprawling, 15,000-square-foot estate in Winnetka was suffocatingly quiet. Peter sat on the far side of the plush leather seat, staring at his phone, a smirk playing on his lips. "You were very quiet tonight, Bea," Peter said suddenly, not looking up from his screen. It wasn't a statement of concern, it was an accusation. "I didn't feel the need to compete with the music, or with your staff," she replied evenly. Peter finally looked at her, his eyes raking over her fuller figure with a distinct look of disgust. "You could at least try to mingle. You sit there looking miserable. It reflects poorly on me. People ask why my wife looks like she's attending a funeral while everyone else is celebrating." "I was celebrating, Peter. I just do it quietly," he scoffed, turning back to his phone. "You just don't fit into this world, Bea. You refuse to hire a trainer. You refuse to dress the part. You're dragging down my brand. My brand. Not our life. Not our marriage." Beatrice turned her gaze out the window, watching the streetlights of Chicago blur into the darkness of the affluent suburbs. She had endured his insults about her weight and her appearance for years. She had watched him transform from a desperate, ambitious dreamer into a cruel, shallow narcissist. She had given him every opportunity to remember the vows they took, to remember the foundation they built together. But Peter had made his choice. He wanted a trophy. He wanted a woman who looked good on a yacht. What Peter didn't know, what nobody in his flashy, high-stakes world knew, was that Beatrice wasn't just a frumpy housewife who got lucky. She was the ghost. She was Aegis Horizon Trust. The affair escalated with the kind of sloppy arrogance characteristic of men who believe they are untouchable. Peter stopped hiding the late-night texts. He started taking mysterious, weekend business trips to Miami and Aspen, trips where Chloe DuPont coincidentally also checked into the same luxury resorts. Beatrice gathered the evidence not with tears, but with the cold, meticulous precision of a forensic accountant. She hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent named Thomas Spencer, no relation, which amused Beatrice, who provided her with high-definition photographs, audio recordings, and a terrifyingly detailed paper trail. The most damning piece of evidence wasn't the photos of Peter and Chloe kissing on a balcony in South Beach. It was a purchase agreement. Peter had used company funds, specifically a line of credit intended for the Detroit warehouse expansion, to quietly purchase a $4.2 million penthouse on the Gold Coast. The deed was registered under a newly formed LLC. The sole proprietor of that LLC was Chloe DuPont. Peter was embezzling from his own company to fund his mistress. The confrontation happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Peter came home unexpectedly early, reeking of expensive cologne and cheap deceit. He found Beatrice sitting in his sprawling mahogany study, a single manila folder resting on the desk in front of her. "What are you doing in here?" Peter snapped, shrugging off his tailored coat. "I told the maid to keep this room locked." "We need to talk, Peter," Beatrice said. Peter sighed heavily, pouring himself a drink. "Make it fast, Bea. I have a board meeting in the morning, and I need to review the Q3 projections." "I don't think you'll be attending that meeting." Peter froze, his glass halfway to his lips. He let out a harsh, patronizing laugh. "Excuse me? Are you managing my calendar now?" Beatrice opened the folder. She slid 3 8x10 photographs across the polished wood, followed by a copy of the Gold Coast penthouse deed, and finally a printout of the diverted company funds. Peter's face drained of colour. He stared at the documents, his jaw tightening. For a fleeting second, Beatrice thought she saw guilt, but it was quickly replaced by something else. Pure, venomous rage. He didn't apologize. He didn't beg for forgiveness. Instead, he went on the offensive. "You went through my private files," he snarled, slamming his glass down on the desk. "You crazy, paranoid bitch. I didn't have to look hard, Peter. You bought your mistress a $4 million apartment using company credit. That's called fraud." "It's my company," Peter shouted, his face turning a mottled red. "I built this empire with my blood, sweat, and tears. I took it from a garage to a Fortune 500 powerhouse. What have you done, B? Huh? You sit in this mansion, eating bonbons and getting fatter by the year. You bring absolutely nothing to the table." Beatrice remained perfectly still, absorbing the verbal blows like a stone absorbing rain. "We took vows, Peter." "Vows?" he mocked, leaning over the desk, his face inches from hers. "Look at yourself, B. Really look in a mirror. You let yourself go completely. I'm a CEO. I'm in the prime of my life. I need a woman who matches my energy, my status. Chloe is everything you are not. She's brilliant, she's gorgeous, and she actually understands my world." He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs with a forced air of calm. "I was going to wait until after the holidays, but since you forced my hand, I want a divorce." Beatrice didn't flinch. "I see. My lawyers have already drafted the papers," Peter continued, walking over to his briefcase and pulling out a thick document bound in blue paper. He tossed it onto the desk. "It's a generous settlement. $5 million in cash, and I'll let you keep the summer house in Michigan. But you get nothing from Spencer Logistics. The company is mine. You didn't invest a dime, you didn't work a single day in the office, and the prenup we signed 12 years ago is ironclad regarding pre-existing business assets." Beatrice looked at the thick stack of papers. $5 million. To a man worth $400 million, it was pennies. It was an insult designed to humiliate her, to remind her that he viewed her as worthless. "You think $5 million is fair?" she asked quietly. "I think it's more than you deserve," Peter sneered. "Sign the papers, B. Take the money and go live a quiet life somewhere. Don't fight me on this. If you try to drag this out in court, my legal team will bury you. I'll make sure you walk away with nothing." Beatrice slowly closed the manila folder. She stood up, her posture perfectly straight. Despite his height, despite his expensive suit, he suddenly looked very small to her. "I'll have my attorney look it over," Beatrice said, her voice eerily calm. Peter laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. "Your attorney? What, the guy who did our wills? Good luck. I've retained Harrison Cole from the top firm in the city. You don't stand a chance, B. Just sign it and disappear." "Goodbye, Peter," she said, walking past him toward the door. "Be out of the house by Friday," he called after her. "Chloe is moving her things in." Beatrice walked down the grand hallway, her footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs. She went to her bedroom, picked up her phone, and dialed a number she had kept on speed dial for a decade. The man who answered did not handle wills. "Arthur," Beatrice said. Arthur Pendleton was the managing partner of Pendleton, Vance, and Hughes in New York City, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms on the Eastern Seaboard. He was also the sole proxy executor for Aegis Horizon Trust. "Beatrice," Arthur's gravelly voice came through the line. "I assume since you are calling me at 9 o'clock at night, the time has come." "He asked for a divorce tonight," Beatrice said, staring at her reflection in the large vanity mirror. She looked at her soft curves, her plain face. She smiled. He offered me $5 million to go away quietly. He also said he's moving his mistress into the house on Friday. Arthur chuckled darkly. Peter always was a man who overestimated his own leverage. Shall I initiate Protocol Delta? Yes, Beatrice said, her eyes flashing with a cold, terrifying light. He claims he built his empire from nothing, Arthur. Let's remind him who owns the ground he built it on. Freeze the company's credit lines, call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning, and prepare the eviction notices. Consider it done. What about his shares? He breached his fiduciary duty by embezzling company funds to buy a penthouse for his mistress. I have the proof. I want the morality clause in his founder's contract activated. We are stripping him of his CEO title, and we are forcing a buyout of his remaining shares at the penalized rate. It will be a bloodbath, Beatrice. He will lose everything. He already lost everything, Beatrice replied softly. He just doesn't know it yet. She hung up the phone, the metallic click echoing in the silent, empty bedroom. Peter Spencer thought he was a shark who had just shed dead weight. But he was just a guppy swimming in an ocean owned entirely by the woman he despised. Monday morning broke over Chicago with a crisp, cutting wind off Lake Michigan. But Peter Spencer felt only the warm glow of absolute victory. Walking into the soaring glass lobby of Spencer Logistics on Wacker Drive, he was practically vibrating with adrenaline. The weekend had been perfect. Beatrice had packed a few bags and quietly vacated the Winnetka estate by Thursday afternoon, offering no resistance, no tears, and no dramatic showdowns. By Friday evening, Chloe had moved her designer luggage into the master suite. Peter spent Sunday sipping champagne on his terrace, laughing at how easily he had excised the heaviest burden from his life. He was 42, terrifyingly wealthy, deeply in love with a gorgeous younger woman, and completely in control. Or so he thought. He strutted into the 42nd floor executive boardroom at precisely 8:55 a.m. for the 9 a.m. quarterly strategy meeting. He was flanked by Chloe, who carried a sleek leather iPad portfolio, and his personal bulldog of an attorney, Harrison Cole. But as Peter crossed the threshold, his smug smile faltered. The room was already full. The entire board of directors was present, sitting in a tense, suffocating silence. David Ross, the chief financial officer, stared rigidly at his legal pad, actively avoiding Peter's gaze. But what made Peter stop in his tracks was the man sitting in the leather chair at the absolute head of the long mahogany table. Peter's chair. It was an older gentleman in a charcoal bespoke suit with sharp, predatory eyes and silver hair immaculately combed back. "Excuse me," Peter said, his voice dropping an octave as he approached the head of the table. "I believe you're in my seat. And this is a closed executive session. Security should have never let you up here." The older man didn't move. He steepled his fingers, looking at Peter with the mild curiosity of a scientist, observing a struggling insect. "My name is Arthur Pendleton," the man said, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded instant silence in the vast room. "Senior partner at Pendleton and Hughes. I am the proxy executor and legal representative for Aegis Horizon Trust." Peter blinked, the irritation momentarily replaced by surprise. Aegis Horizon, the silent 60% majority shareholder, had never once sent a physical representative to a meeting in 10 years. They had always voted by proxy through faceless law clerks. "Mr. Pendleton," Peter recovered quickly, putting on his best corporate smile. "An unexpected honor. We owe Aegis a great deal of gratitude. But as CEO, I still chair these meetings. If you'd like to take the seat to my right, I will stay exactly where I am, Mr. Spencer," Arthur interrupted smoothly. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, this is no longer a quarterly strategy meeting. I have invoked Article 4, Section 8 of the corporate bylaws. This is an emergency vote of no confidence. A collective murmur rippled through the room. Chloe shifted nervously beside Peter. Harrison Cole, sensing the legal danger, stepped forward. Mr. Pendleton, you cannot call a sudden vote of no confidence without providing a documented cause to my client. That is a direct violation of his founder's contract. Arthur reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. He slid them effortlessly down the polished wood of the table. They stopped exactly in front of Harrison Cole. The cause is documented right there, Mr. Cole, Arthur stated, his eyes locking onto Peter. Gross misappropriation of corporate funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and wire fraud. Specifically, the unauthorized diversion of $4.2 million from the Detroit expansion credit line, held by Chase Corporate, to purchase a private penthouse on the Gold Coast. Peter's stomach plummeted into his designer shoes. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. He looked at Chloe, whose eyes were suddenly wide with terror. That was a clerical error, Peter stammered, his usual silver tongue turning to lead. An accounting mix-up. The funds were meant to be drawn from my personal equity distributions. I was going to rectify it with David this week. David Ross finally looked up, his expression hollow. I never saw a distribution request, Peter, but I did see the wire transfer to an LLC owned by Miss DuPont. This is a witch hunt, Peter shouted, slamming his hand on the table to mask his rising panic. I built this company. Aegis owns the paper, but I am the face, the brain, and the engine of Spencer Logistics. You try to push me out over a minor accounting technicality, and the stock will tank by noon. You need me. We really don't, Arthur replied calmly. Furthermore, the embezzlement triggers the morality clause in your 2016 founder's contract. It strips you of your executive protections and forces an immediate buyout of your remaining 40% equity. You can't do that, Peter roared, his face flushed purple with rage. You are just a proxy. I demand to speak to the actual principal of Aegis Horizon Trust. I demand to speak to the owner right now. They wouldn't dare gut the man who made them a fortune. The owner is well aware of the situation, Peter. A quiet, familiar voice echoed from the heavy double doors of the boardroom. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was Beatrice. She wasn't wearing the conservative, frumpy navy gowns she usually hid behind at corporate galas. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored burgundy power suit that flattered her fuller figure flawlessly. Her hair was styled in an elegant, sweeping blowout, and her dark eyes, usually so soft and accommodating, were forged from absolute ice. She walked into the room with a commanding, terrifying grace. The air shifted around her. Peter stared at her, his brain completely short-circuiting. "B? What the hell are you doing here? How did you get past security?" Arthur Pendleton stood up from the head of the table and respectfully pulled out the chair to his right. "Gentlemen," Arthur announced to the stunned board of directors, "allow me to formally introduce the sole proprietor and principal beneficiary of the Aegis Horizon Trust, Mrs. Beatrice Spencer." Silence fell over the room like a physical weight. It was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. "No," Peter whispered, stepping back, shaking his head. "No, that's a lie. That's a joke. You don't have that kind of money, B. You're my wife." "I was your wife, Peter," Beatrice said smoothly, taking her seat next to Arthur. She didn't look at Chloe, who was trembling like a leaf. She kept her gaze fixed entirely on the man who had tormented her for years. 10 years ago, when you were crying on the floor of our rented apartment because Morgan Stanley rejected your final loan application, I made a choice. My grandfather left me a sizable trust fund in London when he passed away. I never told you about it because I wanted us to build a life on equal footing. But you were going to lose everything. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. I knew your pride couldn't handle your wife bailing you out. So I hired Arthur. We created Aegis Horizon Trust. I bought your debt. I bought 60% of your failing company. I saved you, Peter, in secret. I gave you the empire you so desperately wanted to rule. Peter gripped the back of a leather chair to keep his knees from buckling. The walls of the boardroom felt like they were closing in. You owned me this whole time. I protected you, Beatrice corrected, her voice dripping with a quiet, lethal disappointment. And how did you repay me? You mocked my weight. You belittled my intelligence. You treated me like a repulsive embarrassment in front of your friends. And then, you used my money to buy a luxury apartment for your mistress. Be please, Peter choked out, his arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by a pathetic desperation. We can fix this. I'll sell the penthouse. I'll fire Chloe right now. Beside him, Chloe let out a sharp gasp. Peter! Shut up, Chloe, Peter hissed, not looking at her. He took a step toward his wife, holding his hands out in a pleading gesture. It was a mistake, a stupid midlife crisis. You know I love you. We built this together. We did, Beatrice agreed softly. And now I am tearing your half down. Harrison Cole, Peter's lawyer, had been furiously reading through the documents Arthur had provided. He finally dropped the papers onto the table, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. He's right, Peter, Harrison muttered, refusing to look at his client. The trust documents are ironclad. The paper trail on the embezzlement is undeniable. If we fight this in court, you won't just lose the company. You'll go to federal prison for wire fraud. Prison! Chloe shrieked, suddenly backing away from Peter as if he were radioactive. Harrison, do something, Peter begged. There is nothing to do, Harrison replied coldly, packing his briefcase. My retainer was paid by the corporation. As of this moment, you are no longer an executive of this corporation. I don't represent you anymore. Beatrice folded her hands together. Let's review the severance package, shall we, Peter? As per the morality clause, your 40% equity will be forcibly bought out by Aegis Horizon. However, due to the penalization clause for corporate theft, it will be bought out at 20 cents on the dollar. Peter gasped, doing the math in his head. His net worth, which he had proudly touted as $400 million, was being vaporized in seconds. After we deduct the $4.2 million you stole for the penthouse, Beatrice continued relentlessly, and after the taxes on the forced liquidation, you will walk away with approximately $5 million. She paused, letting the exact number hang in the air. It was the exact amount he had offered her to disappear quietly. As for the Gold Coast penthouse, Arthur interjected, looking at Chloe with utter disdain. Since it was purchased with stolen corporate funds, the deed is fraudulent. The property is being seized by Spencer Logistics today. Miss DuPont, you have until 5 p.m. to remove your personal belongings before the locks are changed. Chloe burst into tears, dropping her iPad and bolting from the boardroom. Peter didn't even try to stop her. He was staring at Beatrice, his eyes wide and vacant, like a man who had just watched his own execution. The Winnetka house, Peter whispered, clinging to his last shred of dignity. The mansion is in my name. Actually, Arthur said, flipping to the last page of his dossier. You transferred the deed to a holding company 3 years ago for tax purposes. That holding company is a subsidiary of Aegis Horizon. You don't own the house, Peter. You never did. Beatrice stood up. The entire board of directors watched her in stunned, reverent silence. She had orchestrated the most brutal, flawless corporate decapitation they had ever witnessed, and she hadn't even raised her voice. You told me I didn't fit into your world, Peter, Beatrice said, walking around the table until she stood inches from the man who had broken her heart and insulted her humanity. You told me I was dragging down your brand. You told me to take $5 million and disappear. Peter looked up at her, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. B, what am I supposed to do? I don't care, Beatrice whispered. She turned to the two massive security guards who had quietly entered the room during the proceedings. Gentlemen, Mr. Spencer is no longer an employee of this company. Please escort him to his office to pack one single box of personal items and then escort him off the premises. Cancel his keycard. Yes, ma'am, the head of security said. The aftermath was swift and absolute. True to Harrison Cole's prediction, Peter didn't fight the buyout. He was terrified of federal prison. The Chicago elite, who had once mocked Beatrice, suddenly treated her with a terrified, fawning respect when she officially took over as CEO of Spencer Logistics. She didn't lose weight to fit their standards. She didn't change her quiet demeanor. She simply ran the company with a brilliant, ruthless efficiency that sent stock prices soaring 40% in her first year. Chloe DuPont left Peter the moment the bank accounts were frozen, moving to Los Angeles to find a new, wealthy target. Peter Spencer ended up moving into a modest two-bedroom condo in a generic suburb. The $5 million dwindled rapidly after he paid off the massive debts he had secretly accumulated trying to keep up his billionaire lifestyle. He spent his days sitting in local coffee shops, wearing outdated designer suits, telling anyone who would listen about how he used to be a titan of industry. Nobody believed him. Beatrice Spencer never sought revenge out of malice. She executed justice out of self-respect. While Peter traded his empire for a fleeting illusion of youth and vanity, Beatrice reclaimed her power from the shadows. She proved that true strength isn't measured by a tailored waistline or a loud voice, but by the quiet, unyielding dignity of a woman who finally recognizes her own worth.